Thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me. Sorry for that. All right. So my talk is mainly going to be about modality and contact in some post-colonial varieties of English with some special focus on Singapore English. And what I'll try to do is to highlight a key data gap in modal studies and to find some solutions for such a data gap. As I said, it's about modality, but what's modality? Well, of course, there's a lot of definitions. It's a source of frustration for many linguists. But we want to use a very broad one. We might say it's about the expression of necessity and possibility of propositions. And we know that in English, there's many constructions conveying that. Here I've got a list. But today I'll be focusing on those expressing mainly necessity and obligation, such as must, have to, and so forth. And the main question of my talk, what really gravitates around my talk today, is what happened to these constructions in contact varieties of English when English has been in contact with many languages over the years, over the generations. And in general, unfortunately, there's little attention to the diachrony of modal constructions, in general, the diachrony of these varieties of English, as we do not have data from the first moments of colonization of, for example, areas such as Singapore, not much data. I said, of course, modality is about expression of necessity and possibility, but that's not enough. For example, within the domain of necessity, as well as for the possibility, several scholars have demonstrated that there's different functional categories expressing modality. For example, Palmer refers to dynamic, deontic, and epistemic modality. And in English, we do have constructions. We do have modals or semi-modals that sometimes can be expressed using as a dynamic marker, deontic, or epistemic as have to. You've got here one example. In one, many people have to use a car to travel to work. I define it as dynamic, as here it's about general types of necessity. It's not something related to obligation, which is instead found in two, where the speaker clearly assumes the responsibility for imposing the action by saying, "I'm sorry, but you have to stop looking back, stop looking back on this and moping after him." The third one, so epistemic modality, is rather related to conclusions, logical thinking. So we do not have basically obligation anymore. You might wonder, why am I presenting these modal types, these modal functions here? Well, because in general, different diachronic investigations, typological investigations, have demonstrated that modal constructions, when they grammaticalize, when they evolve over time, they tend to follow a path, and it is generally acknowledged that epistemic modality is the last step of this grammaticalization climb, and so that could be dynamic, deontic, and epistemic. So each step is a sort of photograph of a moment of development of modal constructions. And different approaches have attempted to study modality in contact, not the first one for sure. For example, there's studies related to the substudies approach, even contact grammaticalization, phenomena of colloquialization, and even sometimes cultural motivations leading the use of one modal construction over another. Today I'll be focusing on two approaches, more the substudies one and the contact grammaticalization one. Again, it's not about British English or inner circle varieties of English, but in general it's on modals in Singapore. And these are just some pictures I took a couple of weeks ago in Singapore, where you can see the overuse of modals even in the street, as in must try local food, everything must go, must try ma. So the question is, how are modals used in Singapore? The durians is not related to Singapore. It was just funny to put the picture of the durians. Anyway, so firstly, a briefing on Singapore English. As you may know, English is the official language in Singapore. It's been so since independence in 1965, and it's spoken alongside Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil, along as other Chinese varieties, for example. The population is mixed, as you can see here. The majority of them are Chinese Singaporeans. But what is really interesting here is that over time, the linguistic ecology of Singapore has not been stable. It has evolved dramatically. For example, in figure 1, you can see how in the 90s, it was not English the most spoken language at home by the population. Today it is. So we see the increase of English, the increase of Mandarin, and the decrease in green of the other Chinese dialects. That's how Singaporeans call them. So the question is there going to be a change in the use of modal constructions over time when there is a linguistic ecology that is changing as well? And for example, I'm referring here to a paper that was published in 2010 by Bao Jiming, and what he found in his investigation was that in Singapore English, must is used mainly as a non-epistemic marker. So not very often as an epistemic marker. And he explained that by arguing that this is due to the influence of Mandarin, where there is a construction bishu that is basically always used non-epistemically, never epistemically. It has not grammaticalized to epistemic uses. As you can see in examples 4 and 5, that's how Mandarin Singaporeans in general, they would use the non-epistemic modality with bishu, whereas in 5, they would use other constructions for the expression of epistemic modality. And Bao's conclusions in that study were based on data from the International Corpus of English, you may know, that was compiled, especially as far as the Singaporean subsection is concerned, in the 90s, with data where the speakers, we don't really know what they were the speakers, whether they belonged to one ethnic group, whether they were Malay Singaporeans, Singaporean Malay, Singaporean from the Chinese groups, or young or old, etc. So there's some problems that we have to highlight here. First of all, the linguistic ecology of Singapore has changed over the years, as I showed you before. It's not the same as it was in the 90s. And second, what if the feature that Bao described was also found among speakers of Malay, for example, or Tamil? Would this challenge this substudies approach? Would it be something else, maybe? And that's why, basically, in 2023, I started, well, that's the first paper published on the topic. I wanted to complement Bao's claims, Bao's paper, by analyzing not only must, but also other modal constructions with a more extensive data set. So as you can see here, I'm sorry for the animations. I know there were animations before, I couldn't use that. So we have, on the one hand, basically data from the 90s, so different pictures from different areas in the world, so Singapore, Hong Kong, India, and Great Britain, so that I could carry out a synchronic investigation in the 90s. And then I wanted to add a diachronics, a micro-diachronic study with data from the 90s up to 2021 by using two corpora I compiled myself as well, taken from blogs and internet forums, so informal data. The main objective was, as you can read, to examine the ongoing grammaticalization of Singapore English modality within a dynamic linguistic ecology that is constantly evolving. So what's happening here? There was the question. And in the synchronic data, so again, I'm referring to the data in blue in the 90s, different areas, what I found kind of agreed with what Bao had found, that in general, modal constructions, not just in Singapore, but also in India, Hong Kong, they tended to be used more often non-epistemically than epistemically. But also what I found with the analysis of diachronic data was that compared to British English, which is the historical ancestor of Singapore English, dynamic modality in particular was very often found in the 3 time periods, something that in British English data is very, very small in comparison. So I don't have the graph here, but it will be less than 10%, whereas here the blue part, the dark blue part, was way bigger, right? An example of use of must with the dynamic, as a dynamic marker is here, where the speaker refers to a recipe. So they're not really giving orders. It's just what in British English might have been expressed with need to or have to. If you want to do that recipe, you have to use eggs, let's say, or honey, and so on, right? And by the way, the behavior, this kind of different behavior of Singapore English must is also found in a very recent paper I've been working on with Thomas Van Hooy, who's here, by the way. And we carried out a multiple correspondence analysis, also considering the functional, so dynamic, deontic, and epistemic, as well as other categories. And what we found was that, as you can see, Singapore English must clusters more with have to and need to in all these other varieties than with British English must. So they behave in a different way. So what's the conclusions of that? Well, the behavioral must in Singapore English and its frequent dynamic uses suggest that this construction tends to be less grammaticalized. As I mentioned before, dynamic came before epistemic, right? So if we have an overuse of dynamic uses, well, the reason might be the grammaticalization, right? And diachronic data also contradict Bauer's claim of substrate freezing. What I want to say by that is that basically the substrate is not blocking the grammaticalization of must in Singapore English, as I also found that epistemic uses are still increasing in a statistical way over time. And when there is an increase of epistemic modality, it's very often interpreted as some grammaticalization going on. So that's why we can call it, following Ziegler's term, a replica grammaticalization, a recapitulation. But there is a problem. While my study, the 2023 study, considered the larger data set that I showed you, so diachronic, synchronic, and so on, again, I fell in the same trap. That means that we didn't know anything about the speakers of those corpora. How can we assume that it can be the substrate or it cannot if we don't know whether it was one speaker from one community or another speaker from another? And the production of a marked feature that's attributed to substratal influence by different ethnic groups might challenge the substrate's approach, and at the same time, the production of a marked feature by different age groups might help test with an apparent time method whether there is some novelty in the younger generations, whether there's some difference in use here. So that's why, in response to these limitations, I decided to design and distribute a sociolinguistic survey where I wanted to control some variables, including the age, the gender, and the ethnic group of speakers. And I collected a sample of 258 Singaporeans, and I also collected a smaller sample of British respondents from Prolific, just to have a control group and compare the data, British data and Singaporean data. These are all basically the variables I considered, and the main research question was, do the perception and use of different necessity modal constructions, more precisely must, have to, got to, and need to vary in accordance with these variables, something that was never tested before. And the survey included one section on modal elicitation task. Basically, I was giving some fictional scenarios, and speakers had to write what they would say in those situations. Whereas the second part was more about a sentence completion task, where they had a choice where there were at least two choices. I will not have the time to discuss all the results here, but for example, when it came to the modal elicitation of dynamic modality, I gave a statement which was relevant at the time, 2022 in Singapore: name at least 4 regulations that are currently in force against COVID-19, and what I found was that must was the most produced modal in here. So they kind of went aligned with what I found in the corpus data, as in everyone must wear a mask outside, everyone must be in groups of a maximum of 5 people, and so on. So must was preferred over have to and need to. I also asked them to produce something that was more closely related to deontic modality. It was about scolding somebody who was not a very nice flatmate. And here, again, if we followed Bauer's claim, we might have expected must as the most frequent choice, right? That was not the case. I found rather examples of need to and had better. And it was very interesting to find had better. I was not expecting that. And then I looked at the substrate, and there's a very, very similar construction in Mandarin, which might have modal motivated the selection of that particular modal construction had better in here. But let's have a look at the sentence completion task. Here I asked speakers to select a choice. It was a deontic kind of scenario, and I wanted to test whether the age affected the use of one modal over another. And what I found was that there was a decrease of must over time if an apparent time method was followed, and whereas younger generations, they tend to basically prefer need to. And the overuse of need to is something that, by the way, I had found as well in the corpus data, or also diachronically, I had found a similar kind of pattern with need to increasing over time. And that might be motivated by the influence of Suyao, which is a construction that's found in Mandarin. But the main question is, what about the ethnicity? Is there a change? If we followed Bao's claim, we might have expected the Mandarin community to overuse must in a situation where deontic modality was asked. That was not the case. I didn't find any significant difference in terms of the selection of a deontic modal across the different groups I considered. And whereas for dynamic modality, here you can see that there was a striking difference between Singapore English respondents and British English respondents as far as the use of must as a dynamic marker is concerned. You can see that the orange use is more visible for the Singaporean community than for the British respondents. What are the conclusions of all of that? Past studies on modality in Singapore English often rely on limited data. That's something that is also found for other post-colonial varieties of English, unfortunately. So that's why I feel like that this kind of service might be a good way to integrating also the variable that are not presented in corpus data. And at the same time, what I found in this particular case is that Singapore English is, and in particular modality here, is on the one hand certainly influenced by the lexifier, but there's also something else going on, such as contact, grammaticalization phenomena that shouldn't be overlooked. And considering how ethnicity and age and all these variables are important for this kind of investigations, I will take this occasion to present very, very quickly a corpus that I've been working on along with Stephen Coates, Cameron Mori, and Robert Fuchs, which has just been released. It's a YouTube corpus of Singapore English podcasts, which contains more than 600 hours of spoken, basically, of conversations from Singaporean podcasts, where it has been created with automatic speech recognition models, and it also includes a speaker diarization. And even though, well, that's how it looks like. So you can see we have the data on the left. You've got even recording. You can actually listen to that that part of the data, and there's even a POS tagging. So it might help future investigations on the topic. And even though this first version, that's the very first one, does not contain the variables of age, gender, ethnicity yet, it's something that could be added later on thanks to the multimodal nature of this data. We have videos, we have a lot of information on the hosts, the podcast in general, so this might help test the influence of the substrate further, and to finally maybe arrive to a point where we can say there is maybe some pan-ethnic convergence in Singapore, where we do not have much difference in the three groups, Malay, Mandarin, so Chinese, and Indian Singaporeans, but it's something that, of course, needs further research for the future. So thank you so much for the attention, and let's go on to more. Thank you.